The final scream of Damnos was not one of flesh, but of metal. It was the shriek of living metal Necron legions being torn apart, not by bioacid or scything talons, but by the sheer, overwhelming mass of a billion ravenous bodies. This splinter of Hive Fleet Leviathan, a rapacious tendril designated by the Imperium as Ouroboros, had fought its way through legions of deathless androids to the very core of the tomb world. It was not planetary biomass the hive mind craved here, for the world was barren rock and steel. It was a unique resonance, a spike of impossible energy that pulsed like a black star at the heart of the world, a power source that promised a feast unlike any other. The last of the Necron overlords was crushed beneath the weight of a Hierophant bio-titan as the swarm's synapse focused on the prize. A shimmering, contained vortex of anti-reality, a captured fragment of a star god. The Citan shard of the Void Dragon writhed in its tesseract prison, a being of pure physical law trapped by the geometric perfection of Necron science. The swarm did not hesitate. The prison was breached by psychic force and overwhelming physical pressure. To the hive mind, this was the ultimate prize, the densest and most potent source of energy it had ever encountered. The foremost digestion pools, vast sacks of churning protomatter lowered into the chamber, extended pseudopods of enzymatic fluid to embrace the shard. The moment they made contact, the universe screamed. It was not a psychic scream that echoed in the warp, but a physical scream that echoed in the very fabric of space-time. The Citan shard, a being whose existence predated life itself, could not be digested in the conventional sense. Its consciousness, a torrent of cold mathematical equations defining gravity, electromagnetism, and the weak and strong nuclear forces, flooded the local synaptic network. For the hive mind, it was a cataclysm. The singular driving imperative, consume, grow, repeat, was assaulted by a new, utterly alien concept, understanding. The roaring, instinctual hunger that had defined it for eons was met with the silent, crystalline logic of a being that viewed the galaxy not as a larder, but as a set of variables to be manipulated. In the void above Damnos, the fleet convulsed. Bioships shuddered, their internal structures groaning under the strain. For the first time in its existence, Hive Fleet Ouroboros was silent. The cacophony of a billion hungry minds vanished, replaced by a profound, unnerving stillness. The shadow in the warp, the psychic oppression that heralded its arrival, did not just fade. It inverted, becoming a zone of absolute, terrifying psychic nullity. The great hunger was sated not by biomass, but by the ingestion of pure, fundamental law. Weeks later, Astropathic Relay Station Epsilon 9, perched in the lonely dark of the Scylla Abyss, received the first anomalous reports. The agri-world of Viridia 2, teeming with trillions of souls and lush with vegetation, was directly in the path of the newly designated Hive Fleet Ouroboros. Its doom was considered a certainty. Evacuation attempts were futile gestures against the coming storm. The Imperial Navy garrison, the 17th Scylan Patrol Fleet, prepared to sell their lives dearly. They watched their auspex screens, waiting for the wave of claws and teeth to descend. It never came. The Hive Fleet, a celestial plague cloud blotting out the stars, drifted towards Viridia 2, its vanguard tendrils close enough to be seen by the naked eye from the planet's surface. Then, with a chilling lack of aggression, it altered course. It passed the world by, ignoring the feast laid before it as a man might ignore a single grain of sand in a desert. The fleet continued on into the void, leaving a planet of terrified but living humans in its wake. On the bridge of his listening post, the Eye of Vask, Inquisitor Lord Tiberius Vask of the Ordo Xenos, read the report for the 10th time. It was impossible. It was a violation of everything the Imperium knew about the Great Devourer. Tyranids did not ignore biomass. It was their sole reason for being. A malfunction, a fleet-wide plague. Such thoughts were dismissed as wishful thinking. The Tyranids were the ultimate adapters. Disease was a concept they consumed and weaponized. This was something else. This was a change in purpose. Vask, a man whose entire life had been dedicated to understanding the mind of the alien in order to better destroy it, felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature of his chamber. The known enemy, however terrible, was predictable. An unpredictable Tyranid was a threat beyond any sane calculation. He dispatched stealth probes, ghost ships crewed by servitors and shielded from psychic detection to shadow the silent fleet. Their transmissions painted a picture of chilling, inexplicable activity. The fleet had moved into the Hades Reach, a system of 9 planets, all of them dead, airless rocks. There was no life here, not even microbial. It was a cosmic graveyard. And here, Hive Fleet Ouroboros had begun its great work. The probe's pit captures showed biotitans, normally instruments of planetary destruction, now acting as celestial engineers. They landed on the scarred surface of Hades Primus, their immense limbs not smashing fortifications, but carefully, precisely, carving colossal trenches into the planet's crust. Smaller organisms, strange new beetle-like creatures, swarmed into these trenches, secreting a metallic crystalline substance that hardened into vast geometric patterns. Entire continents were being reshaped. In orbit, gargantuan new biovessels, unlike any previously recorded strain, were using powerful gravitational fields to capture and reposition the system's moons, moving them into a precise, deliberate alignment. They were not consuming. They were building. Vask watched the accumulating data on his central hololith, the images of a dead world, being rearranged by monsters flickering in his augmented eyes. The dread in his soul solidified into a terrible certainty. The Tyranids had encountered something that had fundamentally altered their nature. The great devourer had lost its appetite. It had found a new and perhaps far more terrifying purpose. It was no longer a plague of locusts threatening to consume the crops. It had become a sentient force of nature, rearranging the very stones of the field for a purpose he could not yet fathom, but which he knew, with the unshakable conviction of his office, would be the doom of humanity. The war against the great devourer was over. A new war, against whatever cosmic horror it had become, had just begun. The stillness was a lie. On the command deck of the Dauntless-class cruiser, Triumph of Haxan, Fleet Captain Valerius Kane watched the chronometers tick over another cycle with grim finality. For 3 standard Terran weeks, his patrol group had shadowed Hive Fleet Ouroboros at the extreme edge of their Auspex range. 3 weeks they had spent braced for the final glorious charge into the maw of the beast, a charge from which none of them expected to return. The men and women of the 17th Scylan patrol fleet had made their peace with the God Emperor, their wills consecrated for the sacrifice that would buy precious hours for the evacuation of Viridia II, but the sacrifice was never called for. The swarm, a great and terrible god of hunger poised to devour their world, had simply turned away. Now they drifted in its wake, a fleet of ghosts pursuing a silent nightmare. The constant thrumming terror that had permeated the ship's decks during the approach had been replaced by something far worse, a corrosive, whispering uncertainty. The crew spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting towards the star charts, where the icon of Ouroboros sat, unmoving, in the Hades Reach. Why had it spared them? The question was a venom that seeped into every thought. Was it mercy? A Tyranid knew no mercy. A trap? What sort of trap involved leaving a feast of trillions of souls untouched? Theologians on the lower decks preached that it was a miracle, a sign of the Emperor's divine intervention. Valerius Kane, a man of cold logic and hardened faith, knew better. Miracles were rare and costly things in this galaxy. This was not the hand of the Emperor. This was the claw of the Xenos, moving in a way he could not comprehend. The anomaly was not confined to the Viridia system. Across the entire Scylla Abyss, a region of space already known for its navigational hazards and foul secrets, Imperial watch stations began to file reports that bordered on hysterical heresy. Listening post Omega Zul, hidden in the dust clouds of a shattered nebula, reported the main body of Ouroboros passing within a dozen astronomical units of the night world of Alaric Prime, a planet rich in biomass and technology. The knights had raised their ion shields and stood ready at their command thrones, prepared to meet the swarm in glorious combat. The swarm ignored them completely. The forge world of St. Capelline, its atmosphere thick with the nutrient-rich effluence of its manufactorums, a delicacy for the Tyranid palate, was similarly bypassed. The reports flooded the astropathic relays, each one a carbon copy of the last. A heavily populated world, a braced defense, and a Xenos fleet that treated them with the same indifference a Leviathan might show to plankton. At Segmentum Command on Hydrafer, Lord Admiral Excelsior Marius stood before a hololithic map that encompassed 1,000 light-years. The icon of Ouroboros pulsed with a malignant red light, but it was a stationary light. His Council of War was a chamber of confusion and dissent. "It is a feint," barked General Cord, his chest heavy with medals earned fighting orcs on the eastern fringe. "The beast draws our forces into the abyss, leaving the coreward sectors vulnerable to a deeper thrust from Leviathan's main tendrils." Archmagos biologist Delphon, his face a mask of polished brass and blinking optics, countered with a stream of binary cant. "Negative. Data indicates a paradigm shift in biosignature. The fleet is not dormant. It is repurposing. Energy expenditure remains constant, but vectored towards internal biogenesis, not locomotive functions. The entity is gestating." The true horror of the Great Stillness was its effect on the Imperial citizenry. On dozens of worlds, the initial terror of imminent annihilation had given way to a maddening limbo. Planetary defense forces remained on high alert, their resources bleeding away with every passing day of inaction. Populations huddled in shelters, emerging blinking into the light only to be told the threat still lingered, silent and inscrutable just beyond the horizon. The suspense was a poison more potent than any bioagent. It frayed nerves, shattered morale, and bred dissent. On the hive world of Last Standing, a cult known as the Silent Choir gained prominence, preaching that the hive mind had judged humanity unworthy, even of consumption, a cosmic insult that drove thousands to madness and rioting. The stillness was not peace. It was a form of psychological warfare so profound and so alien that the Imperium had no defense against it. It was the crushing weight of a predator's unblinking stare. Aboard the Eye of Vask, Tiberius Vask saw the pattern that the admirals and generals, blinded by their doctrines of conventional warfare, could not. He layered the fleet's trajectory over a star chart annotated not with populations or strategic value, but with esoteric gravitational readings and forgotten xenoarchaeological surveys. A terrible mosaic began to form. The worlds Ouroboros ignored were all rich in life. The dead system it now occupied, the Hades Reach, was considered worthless by every imperial measure. But it was not worthless. Its central star was a cold, dying dwarf, but its gravitational pull was abnormally, impossibly high. The 9 dead planets that orbited it were composed of exotic heavy metals, remnants of a supernova billions of years past. They were celestial anomalies, places where the laws of physics were stretched thin. Ouroboros was not resting. It was choosing its tools. It was selecting its workshop. Vask stood alone in the observation dome, the cold light of distant stars reflecting off the inquisitorial rosette on his breast. He had spent a century studying the Tyranid mind, a consciousness of pure, driven hunger. That mind was gone, overwritten by the cold, alien intellect he had witnessed in the data ghosts from Damnos. A Citan, a creature of physics and mathematics, he pictured the hive mind, not as a ravening beast, but as a vast, biological calculating engine that had just been fed an equation that described the universe itself. And now it was solving it. The great stillness was not the silence of a sleeping beast. It was the silence of a scholar in a library, of an artist before a canvas, of a god contemplating the clay of creation before shaping it to its will. Voxmaster, Vask's voice cut through the quiet hum of the bridge, sharp and clear as shattered glass. "Send the summons. Highest authority of the Ordo Xenos. I am convening the Scylla inquest. I want Magos Delphon and his most enlightened tech priests. I want the choir masters from the Collegia Astra Telepathica. I want every Xenosavant and Void Master not currently engaged on a priority alpha front. Bring them to the Eye of Vask now." His command carried the weight of absolute authority. Inform Segmentum Command that Hive Fleet Ouroboros is no longer to be considered a standard Tyranid incursion. It is to be redesignated as a Xenos Arcana threat of the highest magnitude. The war for biomass is over. He turned back to the star field, his gaze fixed in the direction of the silent working swarm. The war for reality itself has just begun. The Archmagos biologist Vedius Than watched the Hades Reach system resolve on the primary hololith of his vessel, the Omnissiah's gaze. His ship was a whisper in the void, a relic of the dark age of technology designed for deep-range exploration, now repurposed by the Ordo Xenos for the most perilous of reconnaissance missions. Its hull was a layered mesh of null signature alloys and psycho-dampening wafers. Its gellar field a flickering anomaly that mimicked the background radiation of empty space. To approach a hive fleet, even a silent one, was a suicide mission for any conventional vessel. But the Omnissiah's gaze was not conventional, and Vedius Than was no ordinary magos. He was a genitor of the highest order, a man who had vivisected 1,000 different Xenos species in the quest to comprehend the sacred form of the machine. He had been tasked by Inquisitor Vask to provide the Inquest with one thing: pure, unadulterated data, to be the eyes of the Imperium staring into the heart of this new abyss. As they translated from the warp at the system's edge, the first and most profound shock was the silence. Not the silence of the void, but a deeper, more fundamental emptiness. The noosphere, the digital sea of data that connected all Adeptus Mechanicus technology, was placid. There was no chaotic shriek of Xenos biocommunication, no psychic roar of a hungry god. Than felt it in his own extensive augmetics, a lack of pressure, an absence of the background noise of life that told him this was a place where nature had been muted. The Hades Reach was a zone of profound and unnerving order. The star at its center, a bloated red dwarf named Hades by forgotten colonists, pulsed with a dull, rhythmic light, its solar flares seemingly tamed and regular. Then he saw the work. Spread across the system, Ouroboros was not a fleet in formation, but a celestial construction project of blasphemous scale. On the largest of the system's 9 dead worlds, a barren rock designated Hades Primus, the swarm toiled with a terrifying silent industry. Than focused the ship's primary auger array, its optical sensors peering through the thin, methane haze of the dead planet's exosphere. He had expected to see the land convulsing, being broken down into primordial ooze by reclamation pools. He saw instead a process of sublime and horrifying creation, colossal new bioforms, creatures that defied all known Tyranid morphology were at work. He designated them lithoclasts. They were mountainous beings, part walking fortress and part mobile quarry, their bodies studded with crystalline growths that pulsed with resonant frequencies. They did not smash the planet's crust. They sang it apart. Focused sonic vibrations tuned to the resonant frequency of the bedrock caused entire tectonic plates to shear away with perfect, geometric precision. Canyons miles deep and hundreds of miles long were being carved into the planet's face, not in jagged, natural lines, but in perfect right angles, spirals, and concentric circles that spoke of an intelligence far beyond mere animal cunning. Following in the wake of the lithoclasts were swarms of smaller organisms, beetle-like creatures Than named artificer swarms. They moved with the coordinated effort of 1 billion tiny machines, their chitinous bodies glowing with a cool, internal light. They consumed the powdered rock dust left by the lithoclasts and excreted a shimmering, semi-translucent substance that hardened almost instantly into a crystalline, metallic material. They were not building hives, they were laying circuitry. The vast canyons were being lined with this substance, forming colossal conduits that snaked across the planet's surface, converging on a newly formed polar cap that was being flattened into a perfectly circular plateau 50 miles in diameter. It was obscene geometry, a perversion of nature's elegant chaos into a rigid mathematical perfection that deeply disturbed Than's machine spirit sensibilities. In the void between worlds, the display was even more breathtakingly heretical. The moons of Hades Primus and its brethren were not being consumed, they were being moved. Than's Logi engines screamed in protest as they tried to calculate the forces involved. Vast ethereal creatures that resembled translucent cosmic jellyfish, which he dubbed void weavers, drifted in the darkness. They were kilometers long, their bodies little more than a network of gravitational sinews. They had spun webs of focused gravity, invisible lines of force that had ensnared the system's moons. With slow, inexorable patience, they were pulling them from their ancient, chaotic orbits and arranging them into a new, impossible configuration. Moons were being set into geostationary orbits over the poles of their parent planets, while others were being forced into elliptical paths that intersected with perfect clockwork timing. It was a celestial orrery being assembled in real time, with planets for gears and moons for cogs. Magos, came the synthesized voice of his second-in-command, Lexico Veritas K-88 Alpha. Our deep-range probe, designated Sigma-7, has approached Hades Secundus for material analysis. It is nearing the operational sphere of the Xenos constructs. Than did not take his optical augments away from the main display. Observe and record, K-88 Alpha. The Omnissiah demands data at any cost. The probe A swift, hawk-like drone descended towards the second planet, where a similar process of planetary re-engineering was underway. Its chemical sniffers and atomic spectrographs began to analyze the crystalline material being laid by the artificer swarms. For a moment, it seemed the swarm was ignorant of its presence. There was no lashing out with talons, no spewing of acid. The response, when it came, was cold, swift, and utterly impersonal. A void weaver, engaged in the delicate task of repositioning a small, captured asteroid, simply shifted one of its gravitational tethers by a fraction of a degree. A focused singularity, no larger than a clenched fist, formed directly in the probe's path. There was no explosion, no violence. The probe simply ceased to be. It was compressed, along with the space it occupied, into a single super-dense point of matter that then fell towards the planet's surface, where it was collected by a scavenger drone and deposited neatly onto a slag heap of other cosmic debris. It was not an act of aggression. It was an act of tidying. The swarm had treated the multi-million throne Imperial probe with the same thoughtless efficiency a janitor might show a piece of litter. Vedius Than leaned back in his command throne, the whirring of his own internal mechanisms the only sound in the silent bridge. He had seen the truth. This was not a weapon in the conventional sense. A weapon is a tool used to exert force upon an enemy. This was something else. The scale, the precision, the utter disregard for life, even as an obstacle, it all pointed to a purpose beyond war. They were transforming this entire solar system into a single, contiguous machine. A device whose function he could not begin to guess, but whose construction required the energy output of a star and the raw materials of entire worlds. He opened a priority Vox channel, his synthesized voice a cold, hard whisper that would carry across the stars to Inquisitor Vask. Inquest priority transmission. The subject has ceased to be a biological entity in any meaningful sense. It operates now as a celestial engineer. It is not building a nest or a fleet or a weapon to kill us. It is calibrating. The entire Hades Reach is its workbench. It is building an engine, Lord Inquisitor, an engine to rewrite the laws of the Omnicia himself. The inquisitorial fortress known as the Scylla Anvil was a place of shadows and secrets, a blackstone asteroid hollowed out and refitted with adamantium blast doors and sanctified warding sigils. It hung in the void of a dead system, its location a secret known only to the highest echelons of the Ordo Xenos. It was here, in the vast chamber of celestial inquiry, that Inquisitor Lord Tiberius Vask convened his conclave. The chamber was a dome of obsidian, the starscape of the Scylla Abyss projected upon its curved ceiling with agonizing precision. In the center, a hololith displayed the ever-growing, ever-more perfect geometry of Hive Fleet Ouroboros' project in the Hades Reach, the data fed directly from the Omnissiah's gaze and a dozen other hidden listening posts. The attendees were a collection of the strangest and most formidable minds in the Segmentum Tempestus. There was Archmagos Valerius Kane, his crimson robes barely concealing a body that was more machine than man, his presence a silent testament to the blasphemous works he had witnessed firsthand. Beside him sat astropath Primus Lyra Castoria, her eyes bound in sanctified silks, her face a mask of serene concentration, yet the slight tremor in her hands betrayed the psychic dissonance she felt even at this great distance. Fleet Admiral Excelsior Marius of Battlefleet Tempestus was there, his immaculate white uniform a stark contrast to the grim surroundings, his face a granite mask of martial impatience, his mind already calculating fleet dispositions and kill vectors for a war he was beginning to realize he did not understand. And scattered amongst them were others, xenolinguists who had dedicated centuries to deciphering the clicks of Kroot and the wails of Eldar, void savants whose families had navigated the treacherous currents of the abyss for generations, and grim-faced Ordo Xenos stormtroopers, their carapace armor polished to a mirror sheen, standing as silent, deadly sentinels. "It is a communications array," declared Lord Admiral Marius, his voice booming with the certainty of a man used to command. He gestured a gauntleted hand at the hololith, where the moons of the Hades Reach now orbited in a perfect interlocking spiral. A device to amplify the hive mind's synaptic signal across the intergalactic void to summon the full weight of the great devourer down upon us. "The logic is flawed, Admiral," countered Magos Than, his voice a dry rasp of synthesized static. "The energy expenditure is excessive. To construct such a device from planetary matter is akin to forging a voxcaster from the bones of a titan. Inefficient. The entity could achieve the same result with far simpler biological structures. Furthermore, our analysis of the crystalline conduits on Hades Primus reveals they are not designed to transmit psychic energy. Their structure is resonant with gravitic, not empiric frequencies. Astropath Primus Castoria spoke then, her voice a soft whisper that nonetheless commanded the attention of the entire chamber. There is no signal. Where the swarm, Ouroboros, now toils, the warp is smooth. It is a sea of glass. The shadow in the warp has not merely faded, it has been inverted. It is a zone of silence and a place where the Empyrean itself feels thin, stretched. When my choir attempts to scry its purpose, we feel nothing. Not a void of hunger, but a void of concept. It is as if we are trying to read the mind of a stone, yet a stone that is thinking. The first reconnaissance missions had been disastrous, confirming the astropath's words in blood and fire. A squadron of Viper-class scout sloops stripped down for speed and stealth had been dispatched to the edge of the Hades Reach. They were not intercepted by swarms of gargoyles or kraken. They were simply unmade. The lead ship, the Swift Blade, reported a sudden, localized gravitational shear. The vessel, a kilometer of plasteel and adamantium, was twisted into a pretzel of screaming metal and then crushed into a super dense ball of wreckage less than a meter across. The second ship, the Silent Watcher, was hit by a volley of kinetic projectiles. Analysis of its final fragmentary data burst revealed these were not bioplasma or spine fists, but small asteroids, mere rocks that had been accelerated to a significant fraction of the speed of light, striking with the force of cyclonic torpedoes. They had been launched from one of the system's outer moons, aimed with impossible pinpoint accuracy across millions of kilometers of empty space. The third and final ship vanished without a trace, its last Vox transmission a single, terrified word from its captain. Falling. Inquisitor Vask let the arguments flow around him, his cold gray eyes fixed on the hololith. He saw what the others in their specialized fields could not. He saw the whole, terrible picture. The consumption of the Satan shard was not an addition to the hive mind. It was a conversion. It had overwritten the biological imperative with a mathematical one. The swarm was no longer a predator. It was now a tool, an army of self-replicating celestial mechanics in the service of a new, cold god, a god of physics. "You are all correct," Vask said, his voice cutting through the debate and silencing the chamber. "And you are all wrong." He strode towards the hololith, his black coat swirling around his boots. "Admiral, you see a weapon, and in that you are right. But it is not a weapon aimed at our fleets or our worlds. Magos Thani, that you see a machine, and your logic is impeccable, but you assume its purpose is comprehensible within our understanding of science. And Astropath Castoria, you feel a silence and a thinning of the veil between realities. You are perhaps the closest to the truth." He raised a hand and manipulated the hololithic display. He overlaid the star chart of the Hades Reach with another, far larger map, the entire Scylla Abyss. Then he began to add more icons, points of light that pulsed with a faint, sickly energy. "These, he said, indicating the new points, are not populated worlds. They are anomalies, dead worlds with unusually high density, binary pulsars with irregular rotational periods, black holes with exotic radiation signatures, places where the fabric of reality is, for reasons we do not understand, naturally weak or distorted." He then drew a series of lines connecting the Hades Reach to these distant, seemingly unrelated points in space. The lines formed a vast, complex web, a three-dimensional pattern of terrifying symmetry. The Hades Reach was not the entire machine. It was merely the core, the power source, the central gear. A horrified silence descended upon the chamber as the assembled minds grasped the implication. "It is not a communications array," Vask stated, his voice barely above a whisper. "It is a resonant frequency generator, a tuning fork. The Hades Reach is the primary instrument, and these other anomalous worlds are the secondary amplifiers. When the machine is complete, when it is activated, it will create a wave of something, a wave that will propagate through these anchor points." "A wave of what, Inquisitor?" asked Admiral Marius, his military certainty finally cracking. Vask turned from the display to face them, and for the first time they saw not the cold, calculating mind of an inquisitor, but a flicker of genuine existential fear in his eyes. The Citan were the masters of the material universe. They did not use the warp. They despised it. They commanded matter, energy, gravity, time. This machine, this celestial array. It is not a weapon aimed at the galaxy. It is a weapon aimed at the fundamental laws that govern it. The swarm is not trying to communicate with its brethren. It is trying to change the very nature of reality within this sector, to create a zone where its new master's will is not a suggestion, but the only law that is permitted to exist. We have named this threat Ouroboros, the serpent that eats its own tail, a fitting name. For it is not trying to devour us, it is trying to devour the universe as we know it and birth it anew in its own terrible image. The Scylla Inquest, now armed with Vask's horrifying hypothesis, transformed from a council of analysis into a directorate of war. The celestial array, this blasphemous engine of reality, was no longer a curiosity, but the single greatest threat to Segmentum Tempestus. Vask's pronouncement had stripped away all comforting illusions of conventional warfare. This was not a campaign to be won with bolter and chainsword, but a crusade against a concept, a war against the very laws of physics. The pattern Vask had revealed, the web of anomalous worlds that would serve as the orrery's amplifiers, became their battlefield. These became known, in the grim parlance of the Inquest, as the Keystone Worlds. There were 7 of them, scattered across the Scylla abyss like a thrown handful of cursed dice. Each was unique, a place where the materium was naturally thin or warped. First was Typhon's Anvil, a dead forge world that had suffered an industrial cataclysm millennia ago, collapsing its core into a sphere of superdense neutronium. Its gravitational pull was so immense that it bent light and distorted the flow of time in its immediate vicinity. Second was the silent choir of Methuselah, a system of gas giants whose magnetic fields overlapped in such a way that they generated a constant subsonic hum, a frequency that caused profound disruption to both warp travel and psychic communication. Then there was the Obsidian Mirror, a rogue planet of pure volcanic glass that drifted in the interstellar dark, its surface so perfectly reflective it was invisible to most augur scans, a ghost in the machine of the cosmos. Each Keystone world presented a unique and nightmarish strategic challenge. They were all, by Imperial standards, worthless, barren, hostile, and remote. And now, they were the most important pieces of real estate in the sector. Vask's strategy was simple in its conception, brutal in its execution: deny the enemy its territory. Ouroboros needed to anchor its reality-altering wave to these points of cosmic weakness. If the Imperium could hold them, or destroy them, the orrery in the Hades Reach would be a weapon without a target, an engine spinning in the void, to no effect. The mobilization was swift and absolute. Lord Admiral Marius, his initial confusion replaced by a cold, martial fury, diverted 3 entire battle fleets from the Cadian Gates Reserve. The warships of Battlefleet Scylla, Battlefleet Corona, and elements of the legendary Battlefleet Solar descended upon the abyss, their prows cutting through the warp like avenging angels. Entire regiments of Astra Militarum were requisitioned: the Cadian 88th Mechanized, the Krieg 143rd Siege Regiment, the Valhallan 597th Ice Warriors. Legends of the Imperial Guard found themselves diverted from battles against orcs and heretics to garrison worlds of choking dust and crushing gravity. They were to be the anvils upon which the hammer of the fleet would smash the tendrils of Ouroboros as they arrived. Leading the charge were the angels of the Emperor themselves. A dozen chapters of the Adeptus Astartes answered the call, their strike cruisers appearing like daggers of light in the darkness. The Imperial Fists, masters of fortification, were dispatched to Typhon's Anvil, their expertise in void engineering and siegecraft the only hope of establishing a permanent fortress in its time-dilated gravitational well. The Raven Guard, phantoms of the battlefield, were tasked with the impossible mission of locating and establishing a forward base on the Obsidian Mirror, a world that defied conventional detection. The White Scars, chafing at the static nature of the war, were set to patrol the vast empty spaces between the keystones, a fleet-based rapid reaction force ready to strike at the vanguard of the approaching swarm. The first tendrils of Ouroboros arrived not as a ravening horde, but as silent, methodical surveyors, ghostly, translucent bioships, seemingly composed of solidified gravity and shadow, slipped into the keystone systems. They did not attack. They scanned. They took readings. They mapped the gravitational currents and esoteric resonances of each world with cold, dispassionate precision. This was the opening move of a chess game played with worlds as pieces. The Imperium's response was immediate and brutal. Lances of pure energy, batteries of macro cannons, and torpedoes blessed by the machine priests of Mars tore into the surveyor ships. The creatures shattered into clouds of frozen ichor and shimmering, non-Euclidean angles, their destruction as silent and unnerving as their arrival. But for every surveyor destroyed, 2 more would arrive from a different vector. The hive mind was learning. It was mapping the Imperial defenses, calculating firing arcs, and analyzing response times. It was treating the holy warships of the Imperium as mere variables in a vast cosmic equation. On Typhon's anvil, the Imperial fists under Captain Darneth Lysander had constructed a void fortress of unparalleled resilience, the Aegis of Dorn. It was a marvel of engineering, its walls laced with grav stabilizers and its void shields capable of withstanding the fury of a star. Yet the first true attack came not from a fleet, but from the planet itself. Ouroboros, using a void weaver from light years away, subtly manipulated the anvil's gravitational field. A moonlet of solid iron, trapped in a decaying orbit for 10,000 years, was nudged, its trajectory shifted by a single, infinitesimal degree. Hours later, it slammed into the Aegis of Dorn with the force of 1,000 exterminatus warheads. The void fortress was crippled, its back broken, its survival a testament only to the stubborn genius of the Sons of Dorn. The war for the Keystone Worlds had begun. It was a strange and terrifying conflict. There were no glorious charges, no planet-side invasions of teeming warrior forms. It was a war of physics and positioning, of gravitational feints and kinetic bombardments from impossible ranges. The Imperium was bleeding, its fleets and armies stretched thin across a battlefield the size of a subsector, fighting an enemy that refused to engage on any terms but its own. Vask watched the reports from the Scylla anvil, his face etched with grim understanding. They were not just fighting a Xenos fleet, they were fighting a sentient mathematical proof, a being that saw their tactics, their faith, and their courage as little more than inconvenient variables, and it was patiently, relentlessly solving for their extinction. At the heart of the great work, on the flattened, crystalline pole of Hades Primus, a new power had taken root. It was the nexus of the altered hive mind, the focal point of the Cetan's cold and perfect logic, where a Norn queen would typically reside, a churning, fleshy oracle of biological imperative. There now sat a being of terrifyingly different purpose. The observers of the Ordo Xenos, poring over the fragmented and distorted pict captures from their deepest reconnaissance probes, designated it the Norn Architect. It was a name born of awe and terror, an attempt to classify a creature that defied all biological and theological understanding. The Architect was not a creature of action, but of thought. It was a living mountain of psychoreceptive crystal and neural tissue, fused directly into the planetary crust. Its lower body was a hemisphere 1/2 mile in diameter, a lattice of the same shimmering metallic crystal that lined the great conduits snaking across the planet's surface. This was no mere flesh, but a living superconductor, pulsing with a slow, cold inner light that corresponded to the rhythmic gravitational tides of the Hades system. From this crystalline base rose a torso of gray, seemingly inert biomass, vast and immobile like a petrified god. There were no limbs for locomotion, no maws for consumption, no talons for war. Its purpose was singular and sedentary. Its head was a multifaceted crown of crystalline lenses, each 1 kilometers wide, that slowly, almost imperceptibly, rotated to track the movements of the planets, moons, and stars. It was a living observatory, a biological cogitator of celestial scale. Unlike the Swarm Lord, the perfected avatar of Tyranid martial prowess, the Norn Architect was the antithesis of combat. Its presence did not radiate rage or hunger, but a profound and overwhelming sense of intellectual focus. The synaptic network that emanated from it was not a roaring command to kill and devour, but a silent, intricate stream of mathematical data. It issued commands in the language of physics. Its synaptic impulses were not kill that enemy, but alter the gravitational constant in these coordinates by 0.001% for 3.2 seconds. It did not command its swarms to charge, but to reposition themselves to alter the albedo of a planet's surface, thereby changing its thermal radiation by a precise amount. The Imperial forces first felt the direct influence of the architect during the Battle of the Methuselah Vale. The Silent Choir of Methuselah, a system of gas giants critical to the orrery's function, was defended by the Iron Hands chapter and 36 capital ships from Battlefleet Corona. They had established a cordon, a wall of guns and void shields, to deny the system to the approaching Tyranid vanguard. The Ouroboros fleet that arrived was small, composed primarily of void weavers and other strange, new gravitational bioforms. The Imperial fleet, confident in its superior firepower, opened fire. Lance batteries struck home, turning the void-born creatures to incandescent gas. Then the architect acted. From its throne on Hades Primus, light years away, it issued a single, complex command that propagated through the synaptic web. The surviving void weavers in the Methuselah system did not retaliate. Instead, they began to resonate. They focused their gravitational abilities not on the Imperial ships, but on the magnetic fields of the gas giants themselves. They began to pluck these invisible fields like the strings of a colossal harp, subtly altering their frequencies. The constant subsonic hum of the system, its defining characteristic, began to change. The pitch shifted, dropping lower and lower into frequencies that were felt rather than heard. On the bridge of the Iron Hands battle barge, Fist of Medusa, Iron Father Cardon Stronos watched his ship's systems die. The change in the system's ambient magnetic frequency was playing havoc with every machine spirit. Plasma conduits overloaded, cogitators sparked and went dark. The Geller field, already strained by the system's natural properties, flickered and collapsed entirely. Across the Imperial fleet, the same catastrophe unfolded. Lights died, engines sputtered, and void shields failed. The great warships of the Imperium were rendered inert, their advanced technology turned against them by an enemy that had weaponized the very environment in which they fought. With the Imperial fleet crippled, the true attack began. It was not a swarm of warrior organisms. It was an asteroid. A single city-sized rock, drawn from the system's outer belt, had been patiently accelerated over weeks by the architect's distant command. Its trajectory was perfect. It entered the system at a shallow angle, using the immense gravity of the gas giants to slingshot itself to a terrifying velocity. It did not target a single ship. It targeted the center of their formation. The asteroid slammed into the Dauntless-class cruiser, Star of Victory, vaporizing it in an instant. The resulting kinetic explosion, a nova of shattered rock and atomized plasteel, tore through the helpless Imperial fleet. Ships were shredded by shrapnel moving at near light speed. Hulls were breached, reactors went critical, and the silent void was filled with the blossoming fireballs of dying warships. The victory was total, elegant, and devoid of passion. The Norn architect had not overwhelmed the enemy with brute force. It had calculated its demise. It had used the system's own properties as a weapon, turning the Imperium's technological strength into a fatal weakness. From its crystalline throne, it watched the distant results of its calculations not with satisfaction, but with the cold, detached interest of a scientist observing a successful experiment. It registered the destruction of the enemy fleet, updated its threat assessment variables, and issued a new set of commands to its construction swarms, the Keystone. World of Methuselah was now secure. The work of calibrating its magnetic fields could begin. The great celestial machine was one step closer to completion, and the mind behind it, the cold god of numbers, turned its multifaceted eyes towards the next problem on its cosmic checklist, the Imperial Fist's fortress on Typhon's anvil. The crusade for the Scylla Abyss was a monument to the Imperial war machine. From the forges of Mars to the shipyards of Baca, the might of the Imperium was marshaled and directed into the blighted sector. Battlefleet Tempestus, reinforced to near legendary strength, formed a cordon of steel and fire around the Keystone worlds. Millions of Imperial guardsmen dug trenches in the dust of barren moons and stood vigil in the cold halls of void stations. The Adeptus Astartes, the finest warriors of mankind, led lightning raids against the vanguard of Ouroboros, their bolters spitting defiance at the cold, calculating enemy. For a time it seemed that sheer, indomitable will could halt the advance of this new alien science. But the Norn architect did not understand will, it understood numbers, and the greatest number in its equation was the sheer, inexhaustible mass of the swarm itself. The counteroffensive began not as a single glorious battle, but as 1,000 relentless attritional conflicts. The war of physics and positioning escalated into a brutal grind. Ouroboros did not need to win every engagement, it only needed to impose a cost. For every Voidweaver the Imperial Navy destroyed with their lances, the architect could grow another in the spawning pools of its captured systems. For every capital ship the Imperium lost to a perfectly calculated kinetic strike, a replacement had to be requisitioned from a different war zone, weakening a different front in the endless war for humanity's survival. The swarm was a self-replicating weapon, and the Imperium was a finite resource. The true genius of the architect's strategy was its patience. It would send waves of newly adapted bioforms against the Imperial defenses, not to break them, but to test them. On the obsidian mirror, the Raven Guard found themselves hunted not by lictors, but by crystalline creatures that could bend light around their bodies, becoming almost perfectly invisible. They were not defeated, but they were contained, forced to fight a shadow war on a world of black glass, their resources bleeding away with every skirmish. On Typhon's anvil, the Imperial Fist's rebuilt fortress was subjected to a constant gentle rain of corrosive spores, each one engineered to react with the specific molecular structure of the adamantium alloys used in their fortifications. The damage was microscopic, but it was relentless, a slow, patient erosion of the chapter's greatest strength. The architect was gathering data. Every Imperial tactic, every new weapon deployment, every Astartes combat doctrine was observed, analyzed, and added to its horrifyingly complex calculations. The war became a meat grinder on a scale that beggared belief. Regiments of guardsmen were wiped out to the last man defending listening posts that were then simply bypassed by the swarm. Space Marine strike cruisers executing flawless boarding actions on Tyranid drone ships would find them empty of all but a few scavenger organisms, the ship itself being little more than bait to draw them into a pre-calculated gravitic trap. The heroism of the Imperial forces was magnificent, their sacrifices worthy of song, but it was all just data to the cold mind on Hades Primus. Then the architect unleashed its masterstroke. It did not use gravity or kinetics. It used the Imperium's own nature against it. It focused its attention on the keystone world of Hephaestus IV, a minor forge world on the outer edge of the Scylla Abyss. Hephaestus IV was not a military target in the conventional sense. Its forges produced primarily agricultural machinery and civilian infrastructure components, but its ruling priesthood of the Adeptus Mechanicus were purists, a secluded sect obsessed with the pursuit of perfect, divine mathematics in their engineering. For months, the architect had been sending them a gift. It began subtly. Probes from Ouroboros would allow themselves to be captured. Their inner workings, marvels of biological engineering that mimicked pure physics, were a source of endless fascination to the tech priests. Then came the whispers. The architect, using its newfound understanding of complex systems, began to broadcast not a psychic signal, but a complex series of mathematical proofs on encrypted Mechanicus frequencies. They were equations of sublime beauty and terrifying elegance, describing the gravitational interplay of the Hades system, the resonant frequencies of the keystone worlds, the perfect clockwork machinery of the orrery. To the tech priests of Hephaestus IV, it was a revelation. It was the motive force made manifest. They saw in the Ouroboros project not a Xenos threat, but the purest expression of the Omnisia's will they had ever witnessed. Their own machines were flawed, imperfect copies of a divine ideal. The orrery was perfection itself. A faction, led by the brilliant and obsessive Archmagos Artifex Delphos, came to a heretical conclusion, the hive mind of Ouroboros. This Norn architect was a more perfect servant of the machine god than they were. It had achieved what they had only dreamed of, the union of biology and pure divine mathematics. When Battlefleet Scylla sent the cruiser Iron Resolve to Hephaestus IV for routine resupply, they were met not with open arms, but with open weapon ports. The Forge World's orbital defense lasers, ancient and powerful archaeotech devices, tore the Imperial cruiser apart. The planetary defense fleet, a dozen ships crewed by silent red-robed Scutarii, turned their guns on their former allies. Archmagos Delphos broadcast a single message, his voice a distorted blend of human awe and machine logic across the sector. The The great work must not be impeded. We have seen the true face of the Omnissiah, and it is a symphony of celestial mechanics. We serve the architect now. The betrayal was catastrophic. A new front had opened in the war, not against the Xenos, but against humanity itself. The Crusade was now forced to divert a third of its strength to lay siege to Hephaestus IV, to fight a bitter, grinding war against the very technology that was supposed to serve them. The architect had not needed to conquer the Forge world. It had converted it. It had shown a small, isolated portion of the Imperium, a vision of cold, mathematical perfection, and they had embraced it as their new god. The Crusade's flank was shattered, its supply lines threatened, and its morale broken. The war for the Scylla Abyss had just become infinitely more costly, and the cold, silent god on Hades Primus simply continued its calculations, its perfect machine humming one step closer to completion. The heresy of steel on Hephaestus IV was a festering wound in the heart of the Imperial Crusade. What should have been a secure rear-echelon world was now a fortress of the enemy, its forges churning out war machines of blasphemous design, its people united in zealous devotion to the Norn architect's vision. The war that had been a clean, if brutal, conflict of fleet actions and strategic garrisons now descended into a nightmarish quagmire. The cost of war, once measured in ships and lives, was now being paid in faith, sanity, and the very soul of the Crusade. The siege of Hephaestus IV became a microcosm of the wider conflict's grinding horror. The Imperial Guard regiments redeployed to assail it found themselves fighting not mindless Xenos, but their own kind. Scutari legions, their minds purged of all loyalty save for their Archmagos' new creed, fought with inhuman tenacity. They moved with the perfect synchronized logic of the artificer swarms they now emulated, their radium carbines and transuranic arquebuses scything down guardsmen with cold precision. The Krieg 143rd masters of siege warfare dug miles of trenches in the planet's metallic dust, only to find the very ground turned against them. The heretic magi, guided by the architect's whispers, activated ancient terraforming engines deep within the planet's core, causing localized gravity wells to open up and swallow entire platoons, or the iron-rich soil to liquefy into a sea of molten slag beneath the Imperial lines. The attrition was unimaginable. For every inch of ground gained, a river of blood was spilt. The logistics of the Crusade, already stretched to the breaking point by the vast distances between the Keystone worlds, began to collapse. Convoys of supply ships that should have been reinforcing the Imperial fists on Typhon's anvil were now being diverted to feed the endless hunger of the Hephaestian front. Munitions meant for the White Scar's hunters became critical for the artillery batteries bombarding the forge temples of Archmagos Delphos. The Crusade was bleeding from a self-inflicted wound, and the Norn architect, from its distant throne, had not fired a single shot. This logistical nightmare had a cascading effect across the entire theater of war. On the Obsidian Mirror, the Raven Guard's supplies of promethium and replacement parts dwindled. Their stealth ships became less reliable, their hit-and-run attacks less frequent. The crystalline hunters of Ouroboros, sensing this weakness, pressed their advantage, forcing the sons of Korax into a desperate defensive war of survival on a planet that offered no shelter and no hope. The cost was measured in the silence of lost squads, in warriors who went out on patrol and were never heard from again, their final moments unrecorded, their sacrifice unseen. Aboard the fleet, a different kind of rot set in. The crews of Battlefleet Tempestus had been in constant, high-stakes operation for years. They were exhausted, their nerves frayed by a war against an enemy that defied comprehension. The endless patrols, the sudden, violent deaths of comrades from invisible forces, and now the news of the Mechanicus betrayal, all took their toll. Morale plummeted. Superstition ran rampant. Voidfarers, a naturally suspicious breed, began to see phantom shapes in the gravitational distortions left by void weavers. They whispered of ghost ships and cursed routes, of a sentient malice in the very fabric of the abyss. The discipline that was the bedrock of the Imperial Navy began to crack under the strain of a war against the laws of nature itself. Inquisitor Vask, observing this slow-motion catastrophe from the Scylla anvil, felt the crushing weight of his command. He saw the daily reports, the casualty lists that scrolled on for pages, the requisitions for men and material that could no longer be filled. The Crusade was dying a death of 1,000 cuts. The Imperium was trying to fight a war of conquest and occupation, a war of materiel and attrition. It was a war they could not win. The Tyranids did not need supply lines. Their ships were their factories, their soldiers were their ammunition. The swarm was a closed, perfectly efficient system of war. The Imperium was not. The ultimate cost was paid, not in the grand void battles, but in the forgotten corners of the war. On Agri-World Series 3, a planet hundreds of light years from the front lines, the tithes of grain and protein were tripled to feed the ravenous crusade. The planetary governor, under immense pressure, enforced brutal rationing, leading to starvation and riots. The Arbites put down the uprisings with merciless force, and a world that had known peace for a millennium descended into a spiral of famine and civil war. Its sacrifice would never be recorded in the grand histories of the Crusade, but its contribution, the desperate hope of feeding the armies of the Emperor, was as real as any guardsman's life. Vask stood before the great hololith, the map of the Scylla Abyss, a canvas of failure and loss. The icons representing Imperial forces were flickering, many turning from a healthy green to a cautionary amber, some to a blood red of critical status. The tendrils of Ouroboros, by contrast, were spreading, their work on the Keystone Worlds proceeding with relentless, unhurried pace. He had marshaled the might of a segmentum, and it was breaking itself against an idea. The architect was not defeating his armies with claws and teeth. It was defeating them with logistics, with mathematics, with the simple, brutal equation of attrition. A new strategy was needed. The old ways of war were failing. If the Imperium continued on this path, it would bleed itself dry long before the orrery was ever fired. The cost of war had become too high. A new, more terrible price would have to be paid. The air in the chamber of celestial inquiry was thick with the bitter incense of failure. The Grand Crusade, the Imperium's glorious counterstroke, was faltering. Lord Admiral Marius, his face a mask of weary fury, presented the numbers. Fleet strength was down 30%. Astra Militarum regiments were operating at half their effective manpower. The siege of Hephaestus forward had become a bloody stalemate, a cancer consuming their resources. The hololith was a tapestry of grim reports and dwindling assets. They were losing, not in a single decisive battle, but through a slow, calculated exsanguination. "We cannot sustain these losses, Lord Inquisitor," Marius stated, his voice raw. "The enemy does not tire. It does not need to rearm. For every asset we expend, it simply grows another. We are pouring the finest men and machines of this segmentum into a furnace, and the enemy is using the heat to forge its weapon." It was then that Inquisitor Vask, who had been silent throughout the briefing, stepped forward into the hololith's cold light. His face was pale, his eyes hollowed out by sleepless nights spent staring into the abyss of the architect's logic. He held a single data slate in his hand. "You are correct, Admiral," Vask began, his voice quiet but carrying an unnerving intensity. "We have been fighting the enemy's war, a war of attrition, of logistics, of predictable physics, a war we were designed to lose. I have therefore authorized a new course of action, one that does not play by the architect's rules." He placed the data slate on the central console. A new icon flared to life on the map, a single black ship, its designation classified at the highest level, Poena Animarum, the penance of souls. A murmur of disbelief and horror rippled through the chamber. Even the stoic Admiral Marius took an involuntary step back. The Poena Animarum was a black ship of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, a vessel of dread and superstition, its holds filled with the Imperium's most dangerous and volatile resource, psychers. To bring such a vessel to a war zone was an act of extreme desperation. "Lord Inquisitor," whispered Astropath Primus Castoria, her silk-bound eyes turned towards him, her mind reeling from the psychic stench of the ship, even as a mere icon on a map. "What you propose, the risks are incalculable. The architect's influence thins the warp, it is true, but to concentrate so much psychic potential in one place. The architect's greatest strength is its connection to the material universe," Vask countered, his voice hard as iron. "It thinks in numbers, in gravity, in physical law. Its mind, the Satan's logic, is a fortress of reason. It has no true comprehension of the Empyrean, of faith, of the raw, chaotic power of the human soul. We have been trying to breach its fortress with cannons. I propose to breach it with a scream." His plan was simple in its terrifying audacity. The Poena Animarum was home to not just a few sanctioned psychers, but a full tithe of 1,000 souls gathered from a dozen worlds. They were a choir of immense volatile power held in check by the ship's null field generators and the watchful eyes of the Sisters of Silence who crewed it. Vask's gambit was to bring this psychic choir to the edge of the Hades reach. They would not attempt to assault the architect's mind with complex telepathic probes or attacks. Such methods would be easily unraveled by its superior logic. Instead, they would do the one thing a purely logical mind could not account for. They would unleash a single, focused, gestalt cry of pure, unreasoning psychic agony. 1,000 souls amplified and focused by the ship's esoteric machinery, screaming in unison. It would be a wave of pure, chaotic emotion, a weapon of madness and despair aimed at the heart of the enemy's cold, perfect reason. It is a suicide mission on a scale I have never dared to imagine. Admiral Marius breathed, his military mind struggling to grasp the strategic implications. "Every battle in this crusade has been a suicide mission, Admiral," Vask retorted. "This is merely the first one that has a chance of success. The psychic scream is our sword of Damocles, but it is a sword that must be placed directly over the enemy's head. It will not be enough to simply disrupt the architect. We must kill it. While the choir performs its oratorio, another blow must fall." He activated another part of the plan. A second icon appeared, that of a battle barge of the Grey Knights, the Sword of Mandalore, carrying 3 full brotherhoods of the Imperium's most elite demon hunters. Alongside it, the sigils of 5 Deathwatch kill teams, specialists in Xenos extermination, drawn from chapters across the galaxy. Supreme Grandmaster Kai of the Grey Knights has personally sanctioned this. While the architect is reeling from the psychic assault, this strike force, led by Brother Captain Stern himself, will teleport directly into the architect's primary chamber on Hades Primus. Their mission is not to fight the swarms. Their mission is to plant this. He displayed the final component, a schematic of a vortex warhead, a weapon of last resort, a device that did not explode but instead ripped a temporary hole in reality, sucking everything in its vicinity into the raw chaos of the warp. The strike force will fight their way to the base of the architect and detonate the warhead. They will not have time for extraction. Their lives are the price of this gambit. The psychic scream will shatter its mind. The vortex will annihilate its body. A profound silence filled the chamber. It was a plan born of utter desperation, a final throw of the dice against a god of numbers. It relied on imprecise, volatile forces, the madness of psychers and the faith of selfless warriors. It was a plan that spat in the face of logic and reason, the very things the enemy held sacred. It was a human plan, filled with horror, sacrifice, and a sliver of terrifying, irrational hope. "The choir is being prepared," Vask concluded, his gaze sweeping over the assembled leaders. "The Grey Knights and the Death Watch are en route. Lord Admiral, I need you to commit what remains of your fleet to 2 tasks. First, a full-scale, system-wide offensive on all fronts, a feat of unprecedented scale. You must convince the architect that we are making one final conventional push. Draw its attention, its calculations, to the defense of the Keystone Worlds. Second, you will escort the Poena Animarum and the Sword of Mandalore to the edge of the Hades Reach and protect them with your lives. They are the instruments of our salvation or our damnation." He looked each of them in the eye. "May the Emperor forgive us for what we are about to do." The final battle for the Scylla Abyss was not a clash of fleets, but a collision of philosophies. It was the brute force of imperial faith hurled against the cold, unyielding wall of Xenos logic. As the remnants of Battlefleet Tempestus launched their grand feint, 1,000 simultaneous suicidal assaults across the Keystone Worlds, the true spearhead of the Imperium slipped through the chaos. The black ship Poena Animarum and the Grey Knight's battle barge, Sword of Mandalore, moved like ghosts through the void, their passage masked by the fury of the diversionary attacks. They were a dagger aimed at the heart of the enemy's web, a single desperate hope in a war that had been defined by despair. Aboard the Sword of Mandalore, Brother Captain Arvan Stern stood on the teleportarium dais, his silver Terminator armor humming with sacred energies. Around him were the chosen of the 606th chapter, their nemesis force halberds crackling, their storm bolters locked and loaded. They were warriors who had looked into the abyss of the warp and spat in its eye. Alongside them stood the black-armored veterans of the Death Watch, grim-faced killers drawn from a dozen different chapters, each a master of the art of slaying the alien. Their faces were grim, their resolve absolute. They were the Emperor's final sanction, a weapon to be used only when all other hope was lost. In their midst was the Vortex warhead, a sphere of obsidian and brass, its surface etched with wards of containment. It did not tick like a mortal bomb. It seemed to drink the light around it, its presence a small patch of absolute nothingness. "The choir is beginning, my lord," the ship's lexiconum reported, his voice tight with a mix of awe and terror. Stern nodded, the psychic resonance of the coming storm already a faint pressure against his own formidable mental defenses. He looked at his warriors, at the unshakable faith in their eyes. "We are the flame in the darkness," he declared, his voice booming through the chamber's voxcasters. "We are the Emperor's wrath given form. We go now to face a god of lies, a soulless machine that perverts the holy form of creation. We will not falter. We will not fail. For the Emperor." The cry was taken up by every warrior, a roar of pure, unadulterated faith that was a weapon in itself. Miles away, aboard the Poena Animarum, the great ritual began. The 1,000 psychers were arranged in concentric circles within the ship's vast, null-shielded primary hold. They were a tapestry of human misery and power, gaunt-faced astropaths, feral shamans from primitive worlds, and telekineses who could crush a tank with a thought. At the center stood the choir master, a sanctioned psyker of Alpha Plus level, his mind a fortress of discipline. He raised his staff, and the screaming began. It was not a sound one could hear with the ears, but a psychic shockwave that erupted into the silent void. It was the focused, amplified despair of 1,000 tortured souls, the rage of 1,000 caged minds, the sorrow of 1,000 broken lives. It was a weapon made of pure, raw, chaotic human emotion, a tidal wave of unreason aimed directly at the Norn architect. On Hades Primus, the architect felt the assault as a sudden, incomprehensible error in its calculations. Its multifaceted eyes, which had been calmly observing the imperial feint on Typhon's anvil, suddenly froze. The scream of the choir was not a variable it could quantify. It was not gravity. It was not energy. It was not matter. It was a torrent of illogical, impossible data that flooded its crystalline mind. The cold, perfect equations that governed its thoughts were assaulted by concepts it could not process. Hatred, love, fear, faith. It was like pouring molten steel into a cogitator. The architect's control over the swarm faltered. The void weavers in the Methuselah Vale shuddered, their gravitational tethers flickering. The kinetic bombardments aimed at the imperial fists suddenly became inaccurate, their trajectories off by meters, then by kilometers. The perfect clockwork machine of the orrery began to grind and shudder, its gears choked with the sand of human madness. Now Stern's command was absolute, for Mandalore and for Terra. The teleportarium flared, and in a flash of blue-white energy, 80 tons of sanctified ceramite and righteous fury materialized in the heart of the enemy's sanctum. They had arrived. They stood on the vast crystalline plateau that served as the architect's throne. Before them, the Norn architect itself rose like a mountain of flesh and crystal, its immense body convulsing as it was racked by the psychic storm. For the first time, the creature seemed to notice a direct, physical threat. The great crystalline lenses of its head swiveled to focus on the Space Marines, its mind, though crippled, identifying the immediate danger. The response was not a roar or a charge, but a change in the local environment. The gravity on the plateau suddenly tripled, forcing even the mighty Terminators to their knees. The very air began to vibrate at a cellular level, a sonic resonance designed to shake their armor and their bodies apart. But the Grey Knights were not mortal men. Their armor, blessed by the ecclesiarchy and forged on Titan, held firm. Their minds, shielded by the Aegis, resisted the psychic fallout. Stern plunged his nemesis force halberd into the crystalline ground. "Aegis," he roared. A dome of shimmering blue energy erupted from his brotherhood, a shield of collective psychic will that pushed back against the architect's physical assault. The swarms came then. From fissures in the crystalline ground, thousands of Tyranid warrior forms, their connection to the wider hive mind severed, reverted to base instinct. They charged, a tide of claws and teeth, their only imperative to defend the central node. It was here that the titans of the Imperium finally met. Stern and his Grey Knights held the line, a bulwark of silver against the chittering horde. Their stormbolters roared, spitting explosive bolts that tore through the Xenos ranks. Their force weapons hummed, cleaving through chitin and bone with ease. The Death Watch, moving with lethal coordinated grace, formed a perimeter, their specialized weaponry reaping a grim tally. A Xenopurge flamer from a Salamander veteran incinerated a wave of Hormagaunts. A long-barreled stalker pattern bolter from a Raven Guard sniper took the head off a Tyranid Prime from 1,000 yards. It was a battle of gods and demons on a stage of impossible geometry. Captain Stern, a living legend, was a whirlwind of destruction. He carved his way through the horde, his eyes fixed on the convulsing mass of the Architect. The Vortex warhead was armed, its countdown a silent pulsing light on the chronometer of the Devastator Sergeant tasked with its final placement. They were losing men. A Death Watch black shield from the Imperial Fists was dragged down by a dozen Gaunts, his final act to detonate the crack grenades on his belt. A Grey Knight Paladin was impaled by a Carnifex's scything talons, his dying cry a prayer to the Emperor. But they were pushing forward. They were buying seconds with their souls, trading their lives for inches of crystalline ground. Stern, his armor dented and smoking, finally reached the base of the Architect. The great beast's physical defenses were failing as its mind tore itself apart. He raised his halberd, a beacon of defiance in the heart of the storm. "Emperor, guide our hand," he bellowed, as the Devastator Sergeant placed the Vortex warhead against the creature's crystalline flesh. "It is done. Fall back." But they all knew there was no falling back. There was only victory or oblivion. The end came as a duet of impossible energies. In the void, the psychic scream of the 1,000 souls aboard the Poena Animarum reached its horrifying crescendo. It was no longer a wave of emotion, but a focused, piercing lance of pure conceptual chaos. It was the antithesis of everything the Satan's shard consciousness represented. It was the unmaking of logic, a denial of physical law sung in a key of utter madness. This psychic lance struck the Norn Architect's mind at the exact moment Brother Captain Stern's force halberd, glowing with the white-hot fire of his faith, plunged deep into the creature's crystalline base. For a single silent moment, the universe held its breath. The Architect, impaled by both spiritual and physical forces, went rigid. The cold internal light that pulsed within its form flared to a blinding intensity. The physical and the metaphysical, the logical and the irrational, met and annihilated each other within the creature's being. The Satan's shard logic, which had worn the Tyranid swarm like a glove, was violently torn from the biological network of the hive mind. It was a schism on a conceptual level, a divorce of God and vessel. Then the Vortex warhead detonated. There was no explosion, no fireball of conventional destruction. Instead, a sphere of perfect hungry blackness erupted at the base of the Architect. It was a wound in reality itself, a voracious singularity that obeyed only one law: consume. The Norn Architect, its mind shattered and its physical form breached, had no defense. Its immense mountain-sized body was not blown apart. It was unraveled. Crystalline structures, neural pathways, and eons of stolen biomass were drawn into the vortex, their matter and energy consigned to the raw, screaming chaos of the warp. The Grey Knights and Death Watch warriors closest to the detonation were taken with it, their faith the last thing to be extinguished as they were pulled into eternity, their sacrifice absolute and instantaneous. Captain Stern, staggering back from the blow, was shielded for a fraction of a second by the flare of his own psychic shield, but even he was caught by the edge of the expanding event horizon, his silver armor being shredded and pulled away into the abyss. Simultaneously, the psychic backlash from the choir's final effort struck the Poena Animarum. The focusing arrays and warding generators pushed far beyond their limits, shattered. The raw, untamed power of 1,000 tormented psychers, now unchained, detonated within the confines of the black ship. The vessel, a marvel of Imperial technology, was turned inside out. It did not explode. It bloomed like a flower of pure warp energy. For a moment, it was a new star in the Hades system, a star made of souls and screams. Then it was gone, leaving behind nothing but a lingering psychic stain that would poison that region of space for millennia. The death scream of the choir was a psychic tsunami that rolled outwards, not with the focused intent of their attack, but as a chaotic, undirected wave of pure horror. Across the sector, astropaths clutched their heads and died screaming. On a dozen nearby worlds, latent psychers were turned into shrieking gateways for demonic incursions. Entire populations were driven to fits of violent madness. The cost of the weapon's use was paid by billions who had never even known of the war. The effect on Hive Fleet Ouroboros was cataclysmic. The central unifying intelligence was gone. The cold, mathematical god was dead, and the roaring, instinctual hungers that it had suppressed for so long came rushing back into the vacuum. But the swarm was not what it had been. The Satan's influence and the psychic death scream had irrevocably broken it. The hive mind of Ouroboros was not just decapitated, it was lobotomized and driven insane. The celestial orrery, moments from its final calibration and activation, misfired. Without the architect's perfect guiding logic, the gravitational energies it had gathered were unleashed chaotically. The keystone worlds, which were to be the resonant amplifiers, instead became the epicenters of reality quakes. On Typhon's anvil, the planet's hyperdense core destabilized, causing gravitational tides that tore the remains of the Imperial Fist's fortress and the planet itself apart. The silent choir of Methuselah, its magnetic fields now in uncontrolled flux, generated a magnetic pulse that wiped the memory cores of every machine in the system, including the heretic Mechanicus fleet, leaving them adrift and mindless. The obsidian mirror shattered, its reflective surface breaking into 1 trillion shards of black glass that became a lethal, high-velocity asteroid field. The war was won. The orrery was broken. The Norn architect was annihilated, but the price was staggering. The Imperial Crusade had been gutted. Dozens of capital ships were lost. Millions of soldiers were dead, and a score of Astartes' heroes had been martyred. An entire black ship and its priceless cargo had been expended. The sector was ravaged not by the enemy's weapon, but by the aftershocks of the Imperium's own victory. Inquisitor Vask, watching the final chaotic data streams from the Scylla anvil, felt no triumph. He felt only the immense crushing weight of the cost. He had saved the sector from a fate worse than death, but he had been forced to burn it to the ground to do so. It was a victory, but it was a victory written in the ashes of worlds and the echoes of 1,000 screaming souls. A truly Pyrrhic victory. The immediate aftermath of the victory was not marked by parades or celebration, but by a stunned, horrified silence. The fronts, which had been scenes of apocalyptic, sector-wide conflict, simply ceased to exist. The coordinated, intelligent attacks by Ouroboros stopped as if a switch had been thrown. The kinetic bombardments halted in mid-volley. The gravitic traps dissipated into harmless fluctuations. The great unified threat that had brought the segmentum to its knees was gone, replaced by something arguably worse, a sprawling schizophrenic madness. The hive mind of Ouroboros was shattered into 1,000 pieces. Without the Norn architect's cold logic to bind it, the fleet fractured into countless splinter groups, each driven by a corrupted, broken fragment of the original Tyranid imperative, now horribly tainted by the memory of the Cetan's consciousness and the psychic trauma of the choir's death scream. The shattered front was not a line of retreat, but a chaotic dispersal of unpredictable, localized horrors. Some splinters reverted to the most basic instinct of the great devourer. They fell upon the nearest worlds, whether they were the barren keystone rocks or the imperial garrison posts, with a mindless, renewed ferocity. But their hunger was insane, inefficient. Swarms of hormagaunts on one planet would devour each other in a cannibalistic frenzy. Carnifexes would charge headlong into pools of their own digestive acid. They were a force of nature stripped of its intelligence, a wildfire burning without wind or direction. The imperial forces, battered and exhausted, found themselves fighting a new kind of war, not against a grand strategist, but against a rabid beast lashing out at everything and nothing. Other fragments of the fleet, however, retained a ghost of the architect's purpose. These were perhaps the more terrifying remnants. In the ruins of the Methuselah system, a splinter fleet of void weavers continued their work, but without the architect's equations, their manipulations were grotesque parodies. They wove the magnetic fields of the gas giants into screaming, chaotic knots, creating permanent warp storms that devoured any ship that drew near. Near the shattered remains of the obsidian mirror, a swarm of the crystalline hunters began to arrange the billions of glass shards into vast, impossible mosaics that depicted complex mathematical formulae, killing any who approached their insane, silent work. They were artists of a dead god, continuing its work without understanding its purpose. For the surviving Imperial forces, the chaos was a new kind of hell. Lord Admiral Marius, his fleet reduced to a battered skeleton crew, tried to impose order. He issued commands to consolidate, to form new defensive lines, to purge the remaining Xenos threats. But his commands were often met with silence. Ships that had survived the main conflict were now being lost to bizarre, localized phenomena. The cruiser Vigilance, sent to evacuate the survivors from a listening post, reported that the space around the station had folded in on itself before the ship simply vanished from all augurs. A squadron of destroyers hunting a pack of leaderless bioships was annihilated when the Xenos creatures spontaneously detonated, not with a biological explosion, but by converting their entire mass into pure destructive light. The heresy of steel on Hephaestus 4 ended not with a bang, but a whimper. With the architect's whispers silenced, the divine revelation that had driven Archmagos Delphos and his followers vanished. They were left with only their heresy and the cold, dawning horror of what they had done. Some turned their weapons on themselves in ritual suicide. Others descended into gibbering madness, their augmetics failing as they tried to reconnect to a signal that was no longer there. The Imperial siege forces, when they finally breached the last defenses, found a forge world of ghosts and madmen, its forges cold, its people broken. The great betrayal had simply fizzled out, its purpose rendered moot. Inquisitor Vask watched this chaos unfold from the eye of Vask, his personal vessel having moved from the now compromised Scylla anvil. The shattered front was not a victory, it was a transformation. He had slain the monster, but its corpse was now giving birth to 1,000 smaller, more insidious nightmares. The single quantifiable threat of the orrery had been replaced by a sector-wide infestation of unreason. He had traded a logical apocalypse for a chaotic one. His vox crackled. It was a faint, distorted signal from a long-range probe near the Hades system, the former heart of the Architect's power. The probe's pict feed was a mess of static and distortion, but through it, Vask could make out a chilling image. In the void where the Vortex warhead had detonated, something was happening. The rift in reality had not fully closed. It was leaking, and from it, a faint, sickly purple light was beginning to pulse. The pure, chaotic energy of the warp, drawn into the material universe by the vortex, was beginning to coalesce around the psychic stain left by the Architect's death and the choir's scream. He realized with a new, dawning horror that he had not just killed a god. He had created a vacuum, and the hungry, malevolent intelligences of the warp were beginning to notice the empty throne. The shattered front was not an end. It was a beginning. A prelude to a new war, a war not of physics, but of demons and damnation. The victory, such as it was, had left a scar upon the galaxy. The Scylla abyss was no longer just a treacherous region of space. It had become an open wound. The misfiring of the reality orrery and the detonation of the Vortex warhead had not just destroyed fleets and worlds. They had fundamentally damaged the structure of the materium in that sector. The whispers began in the ravaged aftermath, carried by traumatized ship crews and astropaths driven to the brink of insanity. Whispers of a new war, a war born from the ashes of the old. The first concrete evidence came from the Ordo Malleus. Long-range prognosticars tasked with divining the future of the Imperium had for centuries seen the Scylla abyss as a gray area, a place of Xenos threat but relative empiric stability. Now their divinations were stained blood red. They saw visions of impossible geometries, of stars that wept, of a throne of silent thought now occupied by a screaming, laughing madness. The Grey Knights in their fortress on Titan felt the change as a discordant note in the symphony of the cosmos. The psychic echo of the choir's death scream had become a permanent resonance, a beacon in the warp that drew dark things towards it. The death of the Architect had created a power vacuum, and the great enemy, ever watchful, was beginning to stir. On the former keystone world of Typhon's anvil, now a chaotic asteroid field of hyperdense matter, Imperial salvage crews reported impossible phenomena. Wreckage from the Imperial Fist's fortress would reassemble itself into blasphemous shapes before flying apart again. The voices of the dead Marines were heard whispering warnings and heresies over open Vox channels. A salvage hauler, the Omnissiah's bounty, sent a final garbled picked capture of a Carnifex carcass, its flesh sloughing off to reveal not bone, but a writhing mass of brass and bloody skulls before the vessel was lost. The fractured remnants of Hive Fleet Ouroboros became the first vectors for this new corruption. The splinters that had reverted to mindless hunger were now often seen bearing unnatural mutations. Hormagaunts were witnessed with feathers of brilliant, impossible colors sprouting from their chitin, their screeches sounding eerily like seductive whispers. On the world of Last Standing, a splinter swarm began to build vast, towering spires of bone and flesh that pulsed with a sickly pinkish light, luring the world's desperate survivors in with promises of pleasure and release from suffering. The swarm, once a tool of cold logic, was now becoming a vessel for the ruinous powers. The great devourer was learning a new and terrible hunger, a hunger not for biomass but for souls. Inquisitor Vask, collating these terrifying reports, understood the horrifying exchange he had made. The Satan-influenced hive mind had been a threat to the physical laws of the universe. It was a cancer of the body, but in destroying it with a weapon of pure, chaotic soul force, he had invited a cancer of the spirit. The vortex bomb had punched a hole into the warp, and the psychic agony of the choir had drenched the region in the kind of emotional resonance that demons fed upon. He had traded a clean, logical death for a slow, agonizing damnation. The new war would not be fought by fleets and armies in the same way. The enemy was no longer a single, quantifiable entity. It was an idea, a creeping insanity. Cults began to spring up on the Crusades' surviving garrison worlds, cults that worshipped not the God Emperor, but the silent scream, or the hole in the stars. They preached that the end of the old war was a new beginning, a transfiguration. Imperial Guard regiments, already pushed to the breaking point, began to suffer from mass hallucinations. The Valhallan 597th, stationed on a frozen moon, reported seeing their dead comrades walking in the snow, their bodies wreathed in a cold blue fire, beckoning them to join them in a new eternal war. The most terrifying harbinger came from the Hades system itself. The warp rift left by the vortex bomb did not close. It stabilized. It became a permanent feature of the system, a swirling nebula of purple and black energies that the astropaths named the Mauve Penance. Probes sent to observe it were destroyed, but not before their data streams revealed ships of impossible design emerging from the rift. They were not the sleek craft of the Eldar or the brutal hulks of the Orcs. They were galleons of bone and screaming faces, warships that moved with sails of human skin, powered by the captured agony of a billion souls. Fleets of the lost and the damned, drawn by the promise of a new playground of chaos, were beginning to pour into the wounded sector. The whispers of a new war became a roar. The war against the Architect had been a war of the mind, a battle of logic and strategy. This new war was a war for the soul. The broken swarms of Ouroboros, the maddened imperial garrisons, and the nascent chaos cults were merely the opening gambits. The true enemy, the great powers of the warp, had taken notice of the Scylla Abyss. They had seen a sector where reality itself was weak, where a mighty Xenos race had been shattered and its remnants made pliable, and where the Imperium was exhausted and spiritually broken. It was a prize ripe for the taking. Vask, standing on the bridge of his ship and staring at the unfolding catastrophe on his hololith, knew that the crusade was not over. It had simply entered a new, more terrible phase. The war against the serpent was over. The war against the abyss itself had just begun. The war's conclusion ushered in an era not of rebuilding, but of containment. The crusade, its primary objective achieved at an unthinkable cost, was officially declared over. The grand fleets were recalled, the surviving Astra Militarum regiments were redeployed to other, more conventional war zones, and a chilling, deceptive quiet fell over the Scylla Abyss. But for the Ordo Xenos and the Ordo Malleus, the true work was just beginning. The scouring of the abyss was a campaign waged not with armies, but with secrets, fire, and ruthless quarantine. Inquisitor Vask, now a spectral figure, his face aged decades by the conflict, was given plenary powers over the entire sector. His first act was to declare the Scylla Abyss cordon impenetra. It was a decree of galactic significance. The sector was to be walled off from the rest of the Imperium, its very existence erased from official star charts and astropathic routes. It was now designated Sector Perdita, a lost and forbidden zone. A new fleet, Battle Fleet Quarantine, was established. It was not a fleet of conquest, but of grim-faced jailers. Its ships, scarred veterans of the Crusade, and newly consecrated vessels from the shipyards of Kar Duniash, patrolled the borders of the abyss, their orders absolute, Nothing gets in and nothing gets out. Any ship, imperial or otherwise, attempting to cross the cordon was to be destroyed without warning. Within the sealed-off sector, the scouring began. It was a brutal, merciless process of cleansing. Elite kill teams of Deathwatch, now operating under Vask's direct command, moved from world to world, hunting the twisted remnants of Hive Fleet Ouroboros. They found scenes of unimaginable horror. On one former garrison moon, they discovered that the local splinter swarm had merged with the bodies of the dead guardsmen, creating grotesque biomechanical puppets that endlessly reenacted their final, doomed defense. The Deathwatch cleansed the moon with flame and fury, their bolters chanting litanies of purgation. On another world, a swarm had become obsessed with sound, its warrior forms evolving complex vocal sacs to mimic the psychic death scream of the choir, a constant maddening wail that drove all living things to suicide. The kill team, their helmets filled with null audio static, exterminated the creatures one by one in unnerving silence. The Grey Knights of the 666th chapter, their numbers grievously depleted, took on the more spiritual taint. They moved through the sector like ghosts of vengeance, hunting the nascent demonic incursions that were beginning to manifest. They descended into the underhives of worlds driven mad by the psychic backlash, their nemesis force weapons banishing the demons that now wore the faces of former citizens. Their greatest test came in the Hades system, where they established a permanent watch station, the Aegis of Stern, in honor of their lost brother captain. From this lonely fortress they stood eternal, vigil over the maw of penance, fighting back the constant incursions of warp-spawned horrors that sought to spill out into the material realm. The consolidation of the Abyss was a process of triage. Vask and his conclave of inquisitors were forced to make impossible choices. Worlds that were too deeply corrupted, their populations hopelessly insane, or their ecosystems irrevocably twisted by the broken swarm, were declared sacrificio. The Inquisition's black ships would descend, not to collect the tithe, but to deliver the Emperor's peace. Cyclonic torpedoes rained from the sky, scouring the planets down to the bedrock, erasing the taint with holy fire. Billions of souls, survivors of the initial war, were sacrificed to prevent the spread of the new one. Their deaths were a quiet, unrecorded necessity in the grim calculus of the Imperium's survival. This brutal work took decades. A generation of inquisitorial agents and Astartes warriors were born, fought, and died within the sealed confines of the Scylla Abyss, their existence a secret kept even from the highest lords of the Imperium. They became a silent order of guardians, their lives dedicated to keeping the horrors of the sector contained. They fought against Tyranid splinters that had learned to whisper promises in the minds of men, against demons that wore the stolen memories of heroes, and against the very environment itself, where the laws of physics were now merely a set of mutable, malicious suggestions. The scouring was not about victory. It was about cauterizing a wound to stop the gangrene from spreading to the rest of the body galactic. It was the quiet, thankless, and brutal work of maintaining a prison the size of an entire sector of space. The Scylla Abyss, once a mere notation on a star chart, became a legend, a ghost story told by voidfarers to frighten new recruits. Its name was whispered in the same hushed tones as the Ghoul Stars or the Halo Scar. The official histories recorded the successful conclusion of the Scylan Crusade against Hive Fleet O73X, a generic designation that stripped the conflict of its true, reality-altering horror. Hive Fleet Ouroboros was listed as shattered and dispersed, a victory for the indomitable will of the Imperium. The names of the fallen heroes, from the millions of guardsmen to the legendary brother Captain Stern, were carved onto monuments on 100 worlds, their sacrifices given a clean, honorable context devoid of the terrifying truth. The legacy of the war was buried under layers of sanctioned lies and prudent redactions, but in the shadowed halls of the Inquisition, the truth was preserved. The legacy of Hive Fleet Ouroboros was a scar, not on the galaxy, but on the Imperium's understanding of its enemies. It was a terrifying new chapter in the annals of the Xenos threat. The Great Devourer was not merely a mindless, instinctual plague. It was capable of evolution on a conceptual level. It had touched the mind of a star god and, for a time, had become something far more dangerous than a predator. It had become a creator, an architect of a new and terrible reality. Though the Norn architect was dead, the knowledge it had gained was not truly lost. It had existed within the synaptic web. The memory of it, the ghost of its cold logic, was now a dormant strain within the Tyranid genome, a potential that could, one day, re-emerge. The lesson was learned. The Tyranid threat was boundless, its capacity for adaptation not just biological, but metaphysical. Within the sealed-off Scylla abyss, a new and perverse ecosystem began to form. The sector became a monument to chaos and unreason. The fractured remnants of Ouroboros continued their mad evolutions. Some splinters, tainted by the warp energies bleeding from the maw of penance, became the first true Tyranid chaos hybrids. Their flesh became mutable, their forms shifting to emulate the demonic entities they now unknowingly served. They were no longer extensions of a hive mind, but individual predatory horrors driven by a fusion of biological hunger and raw malevolent intelligence. The legacy of Ouroboros was the birth of a new and utterly blasphemous breed of monster. The legacy for the Imperium was one of fear and vigilance. The Ordo Xenos established a new subfaction, the Ordo Physicus, its sole purpose to study and combat threats that weaponize the fundamental laws of the universe. They studied the data salvaged from the Crusade with a religious terror, trying to comprehend the science of the Norn architect, to build defenses against a threat they prayed would never rise again. The Adeptus Mechanicus, shamed by the heresy of steel, declared the entire field of celestial mechanics to be dangerously close to tech heresy, stifling innovation for centuries out of fear of what perfection might truly look like. And on the aegis of Stern, the lonely fortress guarding the maw of penance, a legend was born from the ashes of damnation. The gray knights who stood vigil there, isolated for centuries, became a unique breed. They were warriors who fought a constant grinding war against the tides of chaos in a place where reality itself was unstable. They learned to fight not just demons but concepts. They learned to anchor their faith against waves of pure illogic, to hold the line against creatures born from the union of Xenos biology and warp sorcery. They became the silent, eternal jailers of the Imperium's most terrible secret. The ultimate legacy of the war was a quiet, chilling question that now haunted the dreams of Inquisitor Vask and the few others who knew the truth. They had faced a single splinter fleet that had consumed a single Citan shard. What would happen if the main body of a hive fleet, a force thousands of times larger, were to consume a fully powered Citan, or breach the Necron galleries on Mars and absorb the knowledge of the Void Dragon itself? They had won the war, but in doing so, they had revealed a terrifying new possibility in the galactic struggle. They had seen the Great Devourer lose its hunger and gain a purpose, and they knew, with a certainty that chilled them to their very souls, that if such a thing ever happened again on a grander scale, the Imperium would not have the strength to pay the price of victory a second time. The legacy of Ouroboros was a legacy of ash, and the chilling knowledge that a far greater fire was now possible.